So the title, as you can see, is The History of Mexican Immigration to the U.S., 1882 to 2020, by Dr. Rafael Alarcon, Colegio de Frontera Norte. And his email is right there as well, ralarcon@colev.mx. Now we can get this started. There we go.
Okay, well, thanks, Jesus, again for the invitation. I am very happy to be here with colleagues from organizations that assist migrants. Thanks also for the opportunity to talk to other people in the context of the confinement. So thanks for making me feel that I'm also part of humanity. And I mean, it's very nice to be here and talk to my wife every day, but we also need to talk to other people. So thank you for that too. And I also want to thank Professor Alex Zaragoza, who is now retired from UC Berkeley, because when I was his teacher assistant, I began to study U.S. history. So I think that he's an excellent presenter. So I think I learned a lot about this. So we're going to start with this presentation about this all-century history of Mexican migration to the U.S. And in the presentation, I'm going to try to analyze the role of U.S. immigration policy in the development of this history, but also the role of social networks. That means the efforts of people to help each other in order to migrate to the U.S., settle, find employment. So I'm going to start with this very interesting graph that summarizes the history of Mexican migration to the U.S. is from the Pew Research Center. As you can see, the history starts in 1850, right after the U.S.-Mexico, during the U.S.-Mexico War, and when the border was redefined. And then there is a very, very slow growth all the way until the 1930s, and then a decline in the number of Mexicans in the U.S. as a result of the Great Depression, and then amazing, very impressive growth starting in the 1970s all the way to the mid 2000s, mid 2000s, when the Mexican population in the U.S. reached almost 13 million. And then, amazingly, a decline after that, when it went down to 11.7. So we're going to start to explain why the decline of the population in the context of the Mexican history. Next, please. Okay, and I'm going to be using the experience of migrants from Chavinda, Michoacán, whom because I began to study the migration process from these people in the early 1980s, and I think that they very well exemplify the migration process to the U.S. As you can see, this is a photograph from Chavinda in Michoacán. As you can see, it's a beautiful town. So why do we have to leave these beautiful towns to go to the U.S.? So we're gonna try to see that. Next, please. And Chavinda is located in the traditional sending region in yellow. That is the most important sending region of migrants to the US in the central western region of Mexico. It's not the least developed region in Mexico. That's why it's interesting to see what explains that this region has sent lots of migrants to the US. Next. Okay, in nearly 50 minutes, I'm gonna try to cover the history of Mexican migration to the US from the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 to today, this period that I define as the restriction and criminalization of immigrants period that started in 1993. So as you can see, I have divided this history of migration into 6 periods. And I'm gonna explain every period, the policies, the US immigration policies that were implemented in those periods, but also the development of social networks. So let's start with the first period, please, that I define from Chinese exclusion to Mexican exclusion. And this is very interesting because from the first period, can I see the next one, please? Yes. In 1882, US Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act that banned immigration from China. Then in 1907, through the Gentleman's Agreement, the governments of the US government and the government from Japan agreed not to send migrants from this country. So with the virtual elimination of migration from Asia, then Mexico became the most important sending country to the United States. So employers turned their heads towards Mexico and began recruiting Mexicans for employment in the US. That's why I think that I can define this period with this phrase, from Chinese exclusion to Mexican inclusion. And this is a very interesting period because in 1917, the Congress passed the 1917 Immigration Act that included a literacy test and an $8 tax for new immigrants. But interestingly, Mexicans were excluded. So here we can begin to see that the US government began to promote temporary migration to the US. Next. Well, there was a labor recruitment system in place that was operating at the border, especially in Ciudad Juárez, who was the main port of entry in those years. But also recruiters were sent to the interior of Mexico, thanks to the railroads that were built by US companies that connected Ciudad Juárez to Mexico City and other cities. So Paso del Norte, or Ciudad Juárez, El Paso, was the main port of entry in those years, and the main sending region was central western Mexico. That includes the states of Guanajuato, Jalisco, Michoacán, Zacatecas, etc., that are called Guajalmich by the Mexican historian Luis González. During those years, most Mexicans worked in the construction and maintenance of tracks. That's why Mexicans called El Traque. But there were also farm workers, mining workers, and very interesting, industrial workers in the Midwest, mainly in Chicago, Detroit, and Gary, Indiana, for instance. There were some Chavindeños working, for instance, in Gary, Indiana in those years. And then a very interesting case. They were Chavindeños who became soldiers and were sent to World War I. And they were not legal permanent residents, they were not US citizens. Like the example of Don Rodolfo from Chavinda, who traveled to El Paso, he crossed the border at El Paso, was recruited to work in Santa Fe. And then in Santa Fe, some government officials approached him and told him, since the United States has helped you, now you have to help to the US and you have to go and to the war in France. Very interesting topic, because remember, he was not a US citizen, he was not a legal permanent resident. There are other Mexican historians who have studied this process. Next. Okay, and this is a table that shows the first norteños that I interviewed in the early 1980s when I moved to Chavinda to conduct this study. I have to mention that from the start, I benefited by the assistance of my wife, Macrina Cárdenas, who is an excellent interviewer, because it was a very interesting research, because we moved with our family to Chavinda to live in this little town, and that facilitated the interviews. So here we have some of the first migrants from Chavinda who left for the US in the period between 1910 and 1919. Many of them were day laborers. That means that they didn't own land. And most of them worked, as you can see, as obreros vía del ferrocarril. That means that they work in the construction and maintenance of rail tracks. And so this is very interesting. And the first norteños, and here, for instance, we have the case of Don Rodolfo, who was sent to France for the war. Next, please. Okay, now we're going to start with the second period that began in 1921 and went all the way to 1942. And I define this period as a period of restriction to immigration and deportation of Mexicans. Next. Okay, first, we have here the national origins quota system that was implemented in the US between 1921 and 1924, all the way to 1965. So during all those decades, the immigration to the US was organized by assigning quotas to the different nationalities. We cannot talk a lot about this, but the idea was to discourage immigration from Southern Europe, Eastern and Southern Europe, and because they wanted to implement more, they wanted more immigrants from Western and Northern Europe. The interesting thing is that Mexicans were also included from any restriction, but in 1921, as a result of the Great Depression, there was a very important process of deportation in which nearly 500,000 Mexicans were deported to Mexico. 455,000 were actually deported. And in addition to them, other Mexicans decided to go back to Mexico because of the problem with the lack of employment during the Great Depression. But so there was an important deportation process in the 1920s that now reappeared in the last few years. Next. Okay, this is a photograph that I found about these chavindeños, Antonio López, Manuel Mendoza, and Maximino Barajas, who were in Pennsylvania in 1928. So as you can see, very elegant for they look very elegant for the photograph, and very interesting, they are in Pennsylvania in 1928. And a few months probably before the beginning of the Great Depression. Next. Okay, this is the anthropologist Manuel Gamio in the late 1920s conducted a study in the United States trying to find the experience of Mexicans in the US, and he used a very interesting technique to follow the origins and destinations of money orders in order to find out the states where the migrants originated. So as you can see, basically most migrants came in the late 1920s from Michoacán, Guanajuato, and Jalisco. So again, is the famous Guajalmich. Next. Okay, now we're going to talk about a very, very important program that was called the Bracero Program that lasted between 1942 and 1964. So 22 years we have this program by which the US and Mexico governments agreed to allow Mexican workers to work temporarily in the United States. Next. Let's pay attention to this photograph. These are Mexican braceros on their way to California. So as you can see, there are only men because the Bracero program was designed only for men, no women. As you can see, everybody looks happy because these Mexicans were hired to work for a few months in the US under the best conditions in the beginning of the program. And if you look, if you pay attention to the different hats, we can begin to see the different origins of these men. You can see that there are, most of the hats are from rural areas. But also you can see that some people wear hats from more urban areas, maybe Guadalajara, Mexico City, and even some men from this person wears a hat that is probably from an indigenous community. So this is a very interesting photograph that shows the diversity of the braceros. Most of them are young, and as you can see, come from different regions in Mexico, but mainly from the traditional ascending region. Next. Okay, this is not a nice surprise because they were subjected, as soon as they were admitted to the US, they were humiliated, of course, because they were subjected to the fumigation station, the braceros. Next. Okay, there were really two programs within the Bracero program, the agricultural program that lasted 22 years and the railroad tracks maintenance program that lasted only 2 years. So as you can see, the agricultural program lasted 22 years in which 4.6 million contracts were issued. That's a lot of contracts. And braceros could have many contracts. That's what is not what we are measuring here is people, is contracts. And on the railroad tracks maintenance program, there were only 80,000 contracts. Very, very few, and the program lasted a few years because the unions opposed this program. But the interesting thing is that why the Bracero program was initiated because of World War II. But the war ended in 1945. Why the Bracero program ended in 1964? That is a very good question what we can ask. Next, please. And according to Manuel García y Griego, there were 3 periods in the development of the Bracero program: the wartime cooperation period, the transition and conflict period, and the stability and termination period. I just have to mention that during the first period, the wartime cooperation period, the condition of the Braceros were better than later. Why? Because during the wartime, the Mexican government had more power to negotiate labor conditions in the US. Then the Mexican government began to lose, didn't have that power in the next periods. Next. And this is another very interesting photograph from 1954, what scholars name the dry out. This is the border between Mexicali and Calexico in California. And I know that this is Mexicali because in the back of the Mexican agents, you can see a dragon. That means that that is a Chinese restaurant. And as you probably know, the Chinese food is the most important food in Mexicali. It's not Mexican food, it's Chinese food. And there are hundreds, probably thousands of restaurants in Mexico. So what do we see here? Well, probably we can say, well, it's a Mexican migrant wearing a leather jacket who refuses to leave the US and return to Mexico. On the US side, to my left, you can see the Border Patrol agents probably trying to push the Mexican migrant to Mexico, but he refuses to cross the border. Well, interestingly, it's the opposite. The Mexican agents are forcing the Mexican not to cross the border into Mexico. And the Border Patrol agents are pushing the migrant into Mexico. Why? Because with the dry out process, the dry out means that they try to dry out the wet bags. So with this, the idea was that the Mexican had to step on Mexican soil and then return to Mexico to dry out and then be able to be, they were able to offer a contract once he left Mexico just by stepping on Mexican soil. So this is a very, very interesting photograph from the LA Times from 1964. Next, please. And then, as I told you before, I began to study Chavinda in 1882. We went to live there with our 2 children. And I consider myself the only Chavindiologist in the world, the only specialist in Chavinda in the world. But to my surprise, a few years ago when I submitted an article for publication, the reviewers told me that there was an anthropologist named Armstrong who went to Chavinda in 1946 to do study about Braceros. So I was so disappointed because I realized that I was not the only one who was interested in migration in Chavinda. But John Armstrong did a tremendous job, like your president says, a tremendous job trying to identify these Braceros and what they did in the US. Here we have a list of Braceros with the year when they left Chavinda to go to work, the months that they work in the US, mainly 6 months. Also the amount of money they saved and the destination of those savings. Very interesting. There is a Jose who is 35 years old and who was a baker who left Chavinda in 1944 for 6 months, and then he used his money to pay the debts and to help the church. This Jose is a very interesting person because Armstrong interviewed him in 1946. In 1982, I interviewed his son in Chavinda, and he told me the same story. So that was amazing that researchers can find cases like this, where you can follow 2 generations of people. Next, please. Okay, and this is a very interesting example, the Texas Proviso of 1952. With all these problems in debate between the US and Mexican governments in regards to the labor conditions of workers in the US, and the objective of US immigration policy to promote the temporary migration of workers, the Texas Proviso was implemented in 1952. And according to the Mexican-American sociologist Ernesto Galarza, he said that through the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952, it became a punishment offense to harbor and conceal undocumented migrant workers. Although Article 274A stipulated that employment could not be considered as harboring and concealment. As you can see clearly here, the employment of undocumented workers was not a crime. The crime was to take them to help them cross the border and to take them to the places of employment, but not to hire the hiring process. So this is something that you can say when the president talk about the United States like the land of laws, you can see, well, but the Texas Proviso of 1952 is a very interesting case to discuss. Next, please. Okay, now we're going to talk about the next period, the era of undocumented migration between 1965 and 1986. Okay, this is the period when I began to start doing research in Chavinda in 1982. So my research began with the era of undocumented migration to the US. Next. Okay, first in 1965, US Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act, also known as the Hart-Celler Act. This is a very important act that was passed during the context of the civil rights movement in the US. So in 1965, the INA banned the restrictive national origin quota system established in 1921 and led to a more diverse universe of legal immigrants based on the criteria of family reunification and occupational skills. This is by Portes and Rumbaut. So as you can see, in 1965, national origin or ancestry was not the criteria used for admitting legal immigrants into the US. The criteria were family reunification and occupational skills as today. Next. So during this period, between 1965, right after the Bracero Program, and 1986, Mexican workers behaved like Braceros. They were able to cross the border, work for a few months, mainly in agriculture in the US, and then at the end of the year, return to Mexico and visit their families. Why? Because it was very easy to cross the border. So that's why in this period, we can see that there was a male undocumented circular migration. People were going back and forth. During this period, we saw also the settlement of former Braceros and their families in California and other states. Here you can see that a lot of Braceros settled in different cities and places in the Central Valley, in Madera, for instance, Madera, California. And circular migration was possible because the border was porous. It was very easy to cross the border back and forth. And as a result of this, Tijuana became the main crossing point. Ciudad Juárez was the main crossing point before. Now it was substituted by Tijuana. And then in terms of Mexican policy, the Mexican government began adopting the policy of no policy in regards to Mexican migration to the US. So that means that in the view of politicians in Mexico, the migration to the US was great for Mexico because people were sending a lot of money through remittances. The social conflicts were diluted because of this process. So the best policy for the Mexican government was not to do anything and leave migration flow. Next. Also during this period, we began to observe the role of social networks. In 1987, I conducted research with Douglas Massey, Jorge Duran, and Humberto Gonzalez, and in 4 different places in Mexico. And the first conclusion, and we published a book in 1987 that was whose title is Return to Aztlán, the Mexican process, the social process of Mexican migration to the US. And the most important conclusion of the book is the role of social networks. We found that once international migration begins, social networks develop to make foreign employment increasingly accessible to all classes of descending society. So that was very clear for me when I began to do fieldwork in California. I observed that Chavindeños who were working in a farm, for instance, they were able to, employers told them, especially if they were good workers, why don't you bring a brother, a cousin, a friend, because I need more workers. So employment was functioning through social networks. And that was great for employers because they didn't spend any money in recruiting workers because their own workers were facilitated this process. So social networks became a central issue in the organization of Mexican migration to the US. It was difficult to develop social networks during the first period because there were few Chavindeños in the US. But now, in the 1960s, there were many, many families of Chavindeños that have settled in different places in California, but especially most families settled in Madera, California, then Salinas, but also in Oakland and Berkeley, and also in Los Angeles. Next. Now I'm going to show you some photographs from my home institution, El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, to sort of illustrate the developments during this period. Here you can see lots of Mexican migrants crossing the border in Tijuana because these people were waiting on the Mexican side, and on the other side they saw the Border Patrol agents in cars. So they were waiting patiently until the Border Patrol agents went for a coffee, took their coffee break, and then when they left, everybody crossed the border and ran into the United States. Next. And this was the border. This was the fence between Mexico and the United States. As you can see, very easy. It was very easy to cross the border through the Cañón Zapata. So that's why circular migration was possible, because the border was very easy to cross. Next. And then on top of that, Border Patrol agents were very friendly to the migrants, as you can see in these photographs. They are guarding the United States border, but they were extremely friendly with their customers because they had those jobs because of the migrants who tried to cross the border illegally. Next. As you can see, everybody was laughing because crossing the border was not dangerous, number one. It was very easy. So it was a very interesting exchange in places like Cañón Zapata in Tijuana. I have to say that my colleague Jorge Bustamante began studying migration to the US in Cañón Zapata by observing these migrants. Next. And Cañón Zapata was a great opportunity for business. Like, for instance, this man founded Comedor El Ilegal, very appropriate name for his business. And he was preparing tacos and carne asada for the migrants who wanted to cross to the US. So El Comedor El Ilegal is a very important business during this period. It was a very important business. Next. And the most important thing about this process is the transformation of societies. And I think that a former bracero from Chavinda, who didn't study a PhD or even a master's, not even he didn't even get a college degree, but he was very smart when he saw the transformation of Chavinda, of his town, when social networks began to operate, and it was very easy for people to go to the US. And I remember that he once told me, women used to cry when their men would go to North. Now they cry when they don't go. Las mujeres lloraban cuando sus esposos se iban al norte. Ahora lloran cuando no se van. So very, very interesting. When migration becomes part of the social life and families begin to see money from the role of money from the US, then everybody wants to go to the US. That's why this old former bracero from Chavinda explained me the transformation of Chavinda when migration to the US became a massive process. Next. Okay, these are the 4 places where most Chavindeños concentrate in California. As I mentioned before, Madera was the most important place, and then Salinas, of course, most people work in agriculture, and then Oakland, Berkeley, and then San Francisco Bay Area, where Jesus and I lived for many years there, and we met there, and also Los Angeles. Next. Okay, now we arrive to 1986, when after 15 years of a heated debate between two sides regarding immigration, undocumented migration, but finally in 1986, US Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA. That affected the immigration process in a very, very important way. Next. First, IRCA contained three important measures: a general amnesty for people who live in the US for many years, and also a special agricultural workers program, a program designed to legalize farm workers. It was very easy to become, to be legalized through this program, and I will give you an example. Then there were also sanctions against employers. Now, this tried to correct the cynic subterfuge of the Proviso, Texas Proviso. So now it is illegal to employ undocumented workers. And also, they wanted also to increase border enforcement. As a result of IRCA, more than 3 million persons obtained legal permanent residency in the US, and 2.3 million were from Mexico. So as you can see, a lot of Mexicans were legalized through IRCA, because especially the SAW program was, it was very easy to obtain legal permanent residence through the SAW program. I interviewed a woman in Oakland, California in the 1990s who became legal permanent resident through the SAW program. She told me that when she went to the interview, she had a letter from a farmer that established that she was working for him in agriculture, picking strawberries. And then she went to the interview in San Francisco, and the immigration agent asked her, how tall is the ladder to pick strawberries? And she didn't know anything about strawberries, only that she was able to buy them at the supermarket. So she said 3 meters. And the agent laughed and explained how people pick strawberries. And she was very disappointed. She went home. But after a few days, a few weeks, she got a letter from the INS saying, congratulations, your application has been accepted. So that's an excellent example to see why, again, US immigration policy also promoted, in this case, the legal permanent residency of workers from Mexico. Next, please. This is just a graph that shows the legal immigration process during these years. As you can see, between 1988 and 1992, more than 1 million Mexicans were admitted into the US, but mostly men, because most men were working in the US, and then that's why they were the ones who were admitted legally into the US. But after that, many of them began to take their families to the US. Next. And this is a study I conducted in the early 1990s in Madera with 30 families from Chavinda. And these are, in this table, I show the legal status of household members from Chavinda. As you can see, 41% were US citizens by birth. That means that they were the children of immigrants from Chavinda. Then only 1% was a naturalized citizen, 2 people. 15% were legal permanent residents, and 21% and 6% were legalized through IRCA, so nearly 27%. So that's why IRCA was so important for the legalization and also settlement of many Mexicans in many cities in the US. Next. We're gonna continue with next. Okay, now we arrive to the last period that I define as the restriction and criminalization of immigrants period that began in 1993 and extend until today. Next. First, let's pay attention to some of the most important immigration policy issues. First, in 1990, the Immigration Act passed by Congress allowed more legal immigration, especially through employment reasons. That's why in 1990, we began to see more skilled migrants arriving to the United States. And remember, especially Indian engineers working in Silicon Valley, where Jesus Martinez was living in those years. And I used to visit him very often. So a lot of skilled migrants arrive temporary and permanent to the US as a result of this law. Then in 1993, the US government decided to increase border enforcement. Remember that was part of IRCA, but until 1993, they decided to do that by, for instance, building the fences. And that's why the fence the wall between Mexico and the United States was built. So now that President Trump talks about building the fence, well, as you know, this is not new. The fence began to be built in 1993, and then there was Operation Hold the Line in El Paso and Operation Gatekeeper in San Diego, with the concentration of technology, border patrol agents in order to stop illegal migration. Then in 1996, very, very important, Congress passed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. That was allowed, among many other things, facilitated deportations. This is one of the most important effects of the 1996. It also limited a lot of benefits for legal immigrants, but it facilitated the deportation of undocumented people, of course, but also legal permanent residents. Because as you know, people with green cards can be deported. The only people who cannot be deported are naturalized citizens. And then in 2001, as a result of 9/11, Congress passed the Patriot Act that also made illegal immigration a national defense issue. As a result of this, and I will show you data, in 2002, we began to see the massive formal deportation of Mexican migrants, the rapid growth of massive deportation of migrants from the interior of the US. Technically, and the legal term for a formal deportation is removal. Next. Oh, it's a repetition, yes. Well, this is a photograph when they began to, well, this is not actually from 1993. It is in Tijuana and San Diego, but as you can see, this is the construction of the wall between Tijuana and San Diego. Next. That's another one. Next. And as a result of the walls, many people began to die in the process of crossing illegally into the United States. It is difficult to estimate the number, but probably more than 6,000 people have died in the process of crossing the border illegally, because people used non-the-traditional routes to cross the border, and as a result of that, died. Actually, one woman from Chavinda died when she tried to cross the border, and that was a terrible situation because her husband was a legal permanent resident in the US, and she was undocumented. I mean, she was living in Chavinda. They had to wait, as you know, many years for her to become legal permanent resident, and they decided that she would cross the border illegally with a cousin, I think. But that was during the winter time, and they died in the mountains in San Diego. So imagine the situation for the husband who decided to wait for her on the US side. So a lot of people blame him in Chavinda because of the death of this woman. Next. Okay, in 2000, we went to, no, 2001, sorry, we went to Chavinda again with an excellent team of researchers that included Macrina Cárdenas, Socorro Torres, and other people, excellent interviewers. And the idea was to go to Chavinda and re-interview the families that we interviewed in 1982 under the research project with Douglas Massey. In 1982, we had interviewed 200 families, and we wanted to interview them again 20 years later. Well, not to our surprise, but what we found, first of all, we didn't find all of the families. We didn't find the 200 families, but we found 184 families. And from them, 20% of those families were now living in the US. So the whole family moved as a result of IRCA. And we didn't find any information about 10% of those families, but we can easily assume that they were also in the US. So probably 30% of the families we interviewed in 1982 were in 2000 living in the US. Next. Another interesting finding in this study was that Madera and Fresno lost people to cities in the US. Like for instance, because most Chavindeños concentrated in Madera and Fresno. But as you know, many of you live in this area that I know very well because I also conducted a lot of interviews in the Central Valley. It is very difficult to work in agriculture, and you didn't get a lot of money for working under those conditions. So with the social networks operating in Oakland, Berkeley, and Los Angeles, Chavindeños left agricultural work and moved to Oakland, Berkeley, that now had almost 42% of the families we interviewed, and also Los Angeles, almost 9%. So there was a displacement of people from agricultural areas to urban areas. Why? Because of social networks. Next. Okay, now we're going to use the next few minutes to talk about the current process of massive deportation. Well, first, we see that the Congress passed the ERA in 1996, the immigration legislation in 1996, and facilitated the deportation process. Well, this law was applied right after 9/11, and I will show you interesting data about that. The important thing about the current massive deportation system is that there is the intersection of the criminal justice system and immigration enforcement. That is the most important aspect in the basis of this process. And this is something that I got from the Migration Policy Institute. Also, another important aspect is the shift from judicial to non-judicial removals. So before, judges were the ones who decided the fate of deportees. Now, DHS enforcement officials are the ones who make this decision. Of course, there are still judges, but more and more DHS officials decide what to do with the people who are in the deportation process. Also, there was the use of previously little use in migration-related criminal charges. And that's why when we talk about criminals, that includes a lot of people that committed immigration-related offenses. That's why the number is so huge, but it includes a lot of these offenses. Then in 2002, the Department of Homeland Security was founded and was in charge of, as you know, security, national security, but also immigration. And then within this department, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Unit, ICE, was created. ICE, as you know, is in charge of deportations in the interior of the United States. Next. Okay. The deportation process includes this, especially these two programs. The 287G program, that is part of the Legal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, that allows a state and local law enforcement entities to enter into partnership with ICE. So that means that local police officers are trained as immigration officers. And 287G programs have been signed by many cities in the United States. Also, the Secure Communities program that was discontinued in November 2014, but President Trump has also put it in place now. Through the Secure Communities program, fingerprint-based biometric data submitted during bookings by state and local law enforcement agencies to the FBI for criminal background checks. So that means when people are booked, their fingerprints go to the FBI, but also to the US DHS, and that's why they are able to identify who is in the process of deportation or committed immigration offenses before. Next. Oh, we're going to continue with the next one. Okay, and also aggravated felonies. aggravated felonies, according to Meissner et al., are used to deport people. These aggravated felonies are not applied to US citizens. It's only for non-citizens. Again, undocumented people, but also legal permanent residents. And we can understand that murder, rape, sexual abuse of a minor is an aggravated felony, as well as the illicit trafficking of controlled substances, money laundering. But also in the F section, you find that domestic violence is an aggravated felony and DUIs, driving under the influence. Here we can debate. Of course, domestic violence is a very serious crime. And also a DUI, because I can kill somebody by driving intoxicated. But there are different degrees in this process. The situation is that a lot of deportees have been deported because of domestic violence and DUIs. And interestingly, domestic violence can be applied retroactively. So if someone committed domestic violence 5 years ago, and today he is stopped by police by committing another a traffic violation, he can be deported because of this retroactive process. Next. Next. Okay, now we're gonna use the official terms of these types of deportation. So a removal, that is a formal deportation, is has administrative or criminal consequences. And deportees are banned from entering the US for 5, 10, 20 years or forever, depending on the accusation. Returns are not based on an order of removal, and they don't have any criminal, administrative, or criminal consequences. Most of the voluntary returns are of Mexican nationals who have been apprehended by the Border Patrol and are returned to Mexico. We researchers knew about returns because most Mexicans who were apprehended at the border were immediately returned to Mexico without legal consequences. That's why migrants tried many times to cross the border until they finally succeeded. But of course, removals was part of immigration law, but they were not applied the way they are applied now. Next. Okay, this is a very interesting graph that I designed with my colleague, Luis Calva. Here you have the two types of deportation of Mexicans between 2000 and 2017. In 2000, as you can see, most people were Mexicans were returned. Actually, 90% of the people were returned to Mexico, and only 10% were deported. Then if you follow the years, in 2017, you see the opposite, where almost 80% of the deportees were removed and only 20% were returned. So now most Mexicans are formally deported to the US than returned. That means with legal consequences. And we're talking about people who have many years of residence in the US. Many of them have jobs. Many of them have very important pensions. And when they are deported, they lose this benefit. They cannot get their Social Security pensions in Mexico when they are deported. So as you can see, this is a huge transformation of the deportation system. Next. And this is just the number of Mexican migrants who have been deported between 1998 and 2017. 4 million Mexican migrants were removed from the US between 1998 and 2017. It's almost the number of people who live in the city of Guadalajara, where I was born. So the whole city of Guadalajara was deported between 1998 and 2017. That's why we're talking about a lot of people who were deported to Mexico. And that mainly explains the reduction of the Mexican population in the United States. So as you can see, between 1998 and 2001, the United States removed around 150,000 Mexicans. But then after 2001, after 9/11, the number of deportees began to grow very rapidly. And the peak year is 2013, with more than 300,000 Mexicans deported. And you see now the decrease in the number of deportations, including 2017. That was the first year that President Trump was president. So even though President Trump talked bad a lot about Mexicans, the number of deportations is very low, has been very low under his administration. Next. Okay, this is the number of, I use the year 2013, the peak year in the number of deportations to Mexico. And here you have the 8 main nationalities of the deportees. Of course, number 1 is Mexico, then Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So if you see these columns, Mexico constitute nearly 70% of all deportees, criminals and non-criminals. And then the usual suspects, the following nationalities are Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And far away, you can see the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil. What you can say about this table? Well, we can only see Latin American and Caribbean countries. You don't see Asian countries, you don't see European countries. So is that mainly Latin Americans are the ones who are getting trouble in the US and then deported? Next. Okay, this is President Trump. And remember that he said that during his presidential campaign, he said that Mexico sends its criminals and rapists. That's a little bit offensive to all Mexicans, but well, he said that, he became president, and then, next please. He, as soon as he became president, he began changing a lot of things, as you know, about immigration. In regards to deportation, a very, very important transformation was the executive order of January 25th, 2017, that expanded the grounds for the removal of non-citizens in the interior of the United States. This is very, very important. It expanded the grounds for the removal of non-citizens. And then also expanded expedited removal. That means that expedited removal was used mainly in the border. Now he extended the territory where people can be also removed in an expeditious way. He also reactivated the Secure Communities Program, as I mentioned before, and also the worksite enforcement operations. Next. Yeah, this is the executive order that was published a few weeks after he became U.S. president. And as you can see, here it says enhancing public safety in the interior of the United States. Next. You can read this very interesting document, but let's just pay attention to the last one, the G section. According to this, it says, in the judgment of an immigration officer, people can be deported when they pose a risk to public safety or national security. So basically, everybody who, according to in the judgment of an immigration officer, not a judge, poses a risk to public safety or national security can be deported. Next. Oh, conclusions. So we're gonna have a few minutes if you have questions or comments. Okay, this is conclusions that I propose to discuss. In this long history of Mexican migration to the US, I think that one important conclusion is that US immigration policy, by action or omission, sought to contract the Mexican migrant as a temporary worker. So I am convinced that by analyzing immigration law, by analyzing other policies, the idea of the U.S. government was to to create the Mexican migrant as a temporary worker, not a permanent worker. The idea was that Mexicans, like Braceros, work for a few years or for a few months in the US, and because of the proximity, then they return to Mexico. So the temporary worker is the ideal worker, or at least that was the idea before. So they can come, work, and then go back in Mexico. Please don't bring your families, don't bring your children, because we don't want to spend on education and healthcare. Actually, two prominent immigration scholars also support this idea about the temporary worker. And Douglas Massey and Jorge Durant also, in their book, Smoke and Mirrors, they provide a lot of arguments to argue that everything was running smoothly until Congress passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, and people moved to the United States with their families. Then another conclusion is that I think I was able to prove that social networks are very effective for the first generation migrants. Social networks are effective for people who were born in Mexico or Chavinda, and then they moved to the United States. The question is, what about the second and third generation? And now, thanks to Jesus for the invitation, I began to think that, of course, now when we interviewed these migrants in Madera in the 1990s, we saw most children were, of course, second generation, but now I am old, very old. After all those years, now there's probably a third generation. So in the Central Valley, in Madera, now you have first generation Chavindeños, second generation, and third generation Chavindeños. So what about their social networks? Are they still useful for them? And now a final question. Removals. That is the formal deportation. Is the ultimate solution to the undocumented problem in the US? So the idea to remove all non-citizens who do not behave properly in the United States, and then that is going to be good for the United States. I think it's time to stop. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to hear your questions and comments if you have them. Thanks again.
Thank you, Rafael. And for the people who are joining us via Zoom, let's check out some of the questions that may be here. And if you have any other ones, we'll be happy to respond in a few minutes. Oh,
Yes.
one comment is that Antonio Lopez is the great-grandfather of one of the attendees, and saw the photo in here. So thank you, Rafael, for sharing that photo. We are going to be making the PowerPoint and the video available via Zoom. So those people who register to the Zoom will be providing a link to the recording that you'll be able to access. And we'll be able to share also the presentation via the civic.org website. We'll include it in there as well. And if Rafael allows us, we'll also be able to share the PowerPoint presentation as a PDF, if it's okay with them. So let me continue reading some of the comments. Well, here's a question, and what has been the response from the Mexican government in protecting undocumented and documented migrants to the U.S.? If you could respond to that one briefly, Rafael, or
Sure.
maybe not so briefly, because it's a very important question as well.
Well, you can probably help me too, because you know a lot about this, Jesus.
No, I'll skip that question, and if you can answer it.
But Jesus, first let me thank Isela, what's her name? Norma Isela Cuevas, for this great information that his uncle is in one of the photographs I showed. Thank you. And I wish I could get in touch with you, because I can now give credit to the owner of the photograph, because of course I didn't imply that that was my photograph. I cited the Facebook source, but it would be great if you can tell me who the owner of the photograph is. Now, regarding the question about the role of the Mexican government, very interesting. Also, in the 1990s, remember that I mentioned the policy of non-policy. In the 1990s, with the rapid growth of Mexican migration to the US, there were, and also remember, and Jesus and I participated in that process during the election of President Salinas in 1988, when it seems that the election was stolen to Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas created a very important movement in the US of migrants in the US. As a result of all these processes, the Mexican government, or I would say the Mexican state, began to discuss their responsibility towards migrants in the US. And there were a lot of very important transformations. First, they now, as you know, they made the nationality a permanent, status. So Mexicans cannot lose their nationality even if you apply for naturalization in the US. And also they, a few years later, the Mexican government also created a system for Mexicans in the US to vote in elections in Mexico, mainly in presidential elections. And also the US government created the, ¿cómo se llama? Mexicanos en la oficina de los mexicanos en el extranjero. Can you help me, Jesús?
Yeah, así se llama, así se llamaba.
Okay. That's as part of the consulates in order to assist Mexicans in many different things. So clearly, as we say in academic terms, the Mexican government began to pay attention to the Mexican diaspora. But with the different governments, I think that now we need to study the different administrations to see to what extent they have done a good job in sort of helping the Mexican community in the United States. Thanks.
One other question that is very much related to that one, but this one focuses on how Mexicans who have not migrated to the US, what their perspective is on Mexicans who do migrate to the US. What can you share with us about that perspective? How do non-migrant Mexicans view Mexicans who migrate to the US?
Okay, very interesting question, and thanks. And that has to do with the culture in Mexico. When I was a child, many years ago, and I remember I am from Jalisco, and my family has, from my mother's side, has a very long history of migration to the US. Also from my father's side, but especially my mother. But when I was a child, the view of Mexicans in the US was very negative. They remember that there was a term that was used to refer to them that was not very nice. But now things have changed because migration became so massive that now basically everybody in Mexico has a relative in the US. So now I think that the perception, in my opinion, has changed in a positive way, because now many people think that they work a lot in the US. And as you know, many presidents have named migrants in the US as heroes. That was the case of President Fox, but also López Obrador just mentioned that Mexicans in the US are heroes, because now remittances from the US are very important for the Mexican economy. Because now well, not me, but other people pay attention to the newspapers every morning to see the number of the millions of dollars that arrive from the US for the Mexican economy, not from as a result of selling oil, but because remittances from the US. So in summary, I think that now the perception is more positive, but there is still some opposition in some groups regarding, for instance, the vote abroad. Many people think that Mexicans who are in the US should not vote because they live in the United States and they don't have to interfere in the Mexican elections. In my opinion, they are wrong because, of course, they continue helping their families in Mexico. They are in contact with Mexico, and I suppose that they have to also decide who the president is. Thanks.
Yeah, and I just want to say also the person who asked the question was Arelis Clemente, who worked with us in the Central Valley. She's from Delano and just graduated from Loyola Law School this past weekend. So Arelis, felicidades. And we want to have you back in the Central Valley after your next job. Let's look at the other questions. Just no questions, just comments. Hugo Morales also pointing out that in March, Mexican immigrants increased their remittances by 30%. So highlighting the ongoing importance of those economic contributions. If there's no other questions, maybe I can ask one, Rafael, and I don't know to what extent you might be able to answer, but if you could just reflect on it. the people that we work with here in the Central Valley and also the other colleagues that are joining us from other parts of the state, they work with immigrants in different ways. They may provide legal services to them. They may be working with immigrants to promote engagement in the 2020 census because many immigrants were afraid of participating in the census. Some of the attendees work for social services agencies that may provide health or other services. Some like Lisa Gao, they run programs in adult schools that also have a very high proportion of immigrants. How would you say that they should take into account social networks in order to better serve immigrants? How can social networks or the utilization of the knowledge about social work networks help them do a better job of engaging or serving immigrants?
Okay.
It's a tough question, sir.
It's a tough question, but yeah, it's a very good question. But first, let me also congratulate Arelis. So she became a lawyer, I understand.
Yes.
It's great. So, and also Hugo Morales, thanks for the information. And of course, as we speak, remittances today in the context of COVID played a very important role because, as you know, now there is a huge problem in Mexico with regards to employment in Mexico. So immigrants in the US who are also affected by the COVID-19 are still sending a lot of money in these very difficult times. So very, very important information. Okay, going back to your question, Jesus. And I was thinking about this question when I realized that now I stopped my research with Chavindeños in 2001. So I don't know much about Chavinda in the last 20 years. But what I said before, I think is important because now in the valley, in Madera, very close from where you live, I think that now you have first generation Chavindeños, second generation, and now a third generation. So now the migrants who arrived in the 1980s are, of course, older and probably retired. But to answer your question, I will answer with a question. I don't know. I don't know to what extent social networks still operate with the grandchildren of immigrants. I don't know if they still communicate with other people from Chavinda or that identity is lost. I have to tell you that I have to go back to the Central Valley and do some research about this. It's very important. I don't know. I know that the migrants, the first generation, of course, they were able to cooperate, to help each other, but I don't know if their grandchildren are doing the same. Probably some of the other colleagues who are attending this presentation know more about this. I have to confess that I will have to do some research to answer your question.
Then let's start planning about initiating the research in conjunction with COLEF.
Let's do that.
Partner organizations.
It's a very important question.
Yeah, no, I think it will be very valuable to all of us as well who work here with immigrant families and to see how those social networks have evolved over the years. Yeah. So I want to thank you, Rafael, on behalf of CVIIC and the colleagues who have joined us. This has been very, very informative and useful. And to the colleagues, once again, who are joining us via Zoom, there's going to be the links to view the webinar again. And also, if Rafael permits, to also share the presentation via PDF. So we'll take care of that. Go to our website in a couple of days, civic.org. It should be uploaded there. And finally, just those who are joining us via Facebook, either via Colette or the CVIIC face page. Give us a like in there if you're there. That's appreciated. Thank you to Colette for allowing us to cross-post the event in their page. Muchísimas gracias. Se lo agradecemos mucho y ojalá que sea la primera de muchas otras formas de colaboración con el Colette.
Thank you, Jesus, and thanks everybody. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you all.